Good evening, everyone. My name is Jillian Durazio, and I'm a communication and history major and a Kevin B. Harrington student ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their local, national, and global communities. A nonpartisan organization, the Institute has been dedicated to promoting an educated citizenry to ensure a healthy democracy for over 20 years. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome back John Avlon to the Institute to discuss his recent book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, A Story of War and Peace and Race and Reconciliation. John Avlon is an author, columnist, and commentator. He is a senior political analyst and fill-in anchor at CNN. From 2013 to 2018, he was the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast, during which time the site's traffic more than doubled to over 1 million readers a day while winning 17 journalism awards. He is the author of several books, including Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics, described by Barron's as a rewarding portrait of a political trend the established parties have tried to ignore, and hailed by themoderatevoice.com as the best political book ever on American centrist voters. Mr. Avlon also wrote Washington's Farewell, the Founding Fathers' Warning to Future Generations, which he spoke about here at the Institute in April of 2018. Joining Mr. Avlon tonight is Professor Hugh DeBruhl. Professor DeBruhl teaches courses about modern European history with an emphasis on Britain and France and military history here at St. A's. His research studies the way in which the American Civil War influenced British discussions concerning politics, society, nationality, race, and military affairs. Recent publications include the essay on Civil War diplomacy in the Routledge History of U.S. Foreign Relations and Ambivalent Nation, How Britons Imagined the American Civil War, published by Louisiana State University Press in 2018. So please join me in welcoming John Avlon and Professor Hugh DeBruhl.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Nice to see you. Appreciate that.
I'll talk to you later.
All right. How are y'all doing? All right. Nice to be back. I love this room.
I've actually taught class in here before during COVID when we had like 20 people scattered across the entire room, but I've never had to speak in front of an audience and be televised like this. So.
Well, it's okay. I was on set this morning with Caitlin Collins, and I told her I was advancing her event next week. I started out as an advanced man in politics, so I've got this cold. So I feel thusly advanced. I don't know if any of you will be here for that, but that'll be quite an event next week.
Well, you're doing a good job of warming up the room. So, so I figured we have a limited amount of time available,
Yep.
right? So we should probably cut to the chase. And I guess the first question I want to ask you is sort of a broad question about this book, which is obviously you wanted to write a book about Lincoln, and you wanted to write a book about centrism. And I guess my question would be, how did you decide to write about that specific topic? And what are the themes that kind of arise from this encounter between Lincoln and centrism that you're talking about?
Well, it's a fair point that when you want to write a book about Lincoln, and there's a good reason to write a book about him. He's great company. He's one of the only historical figures that doesn't disappoint upon closer inspection. And I think that's because his greatness is directly tied to his goodness. He's a genuinely kind man, and that's a quality we don't celebrate enough in general, let alone in leaders. But as my wife always pointed out, there have been 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. Why would you be foolish enough to think you have anything to add? And that's a fair point. But the angle I focused on it isn't just sort of part of my continuing effort to talk about centrist leaders and how they can combat hyperpartisanship and be uniter in divided times. That theme of pushing back against hyperpartisanship runs through most of my journalism and all of my books. But this question of how you win a peace, which is something that has come up again and again in our time. And we don't study peace strategically the way we study war. And what struck me about Lincoln is that he had really developed a plan for winning the peace after winning the war. He was cultivating a vision for national reconciliation and reunification. And the reason it had never been written about is he's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox. So he never gets a chance to implement that vision. But if you go back and you look at his speeches and the conversations he's having with generals and his executive orders, he was developing a fairly comprehensive plan, which can be distilled to unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. But just think about, I mean, the achievement itself of what Lincoln divined, because there'd never been a civil war on that scale before in human history. That's important to understand. So even, the founding generation, as I wrote about in Washington's Farewell, were able to draw upon the lessons of ancient Greek and Roman republics. In this larger question about how to win a civil war and then win a peace so that new wars don't ignite on the ashes of the past, Lincoln is basically alone. And that, I think, adds to the impressiveness of his accomplishment. It's not only that he's fighting to save democracy, and we forget that America is, at that point, the world's sole large constitutional republic on the world stage, and everybody thought we were going to fail, right? I mean, at that time, you go back, I quote some of the foreign correspondents for the New York Times and other papers, and in England and France and every place else, they're laughing expectantly from the sidelines, right? They're basically saying, we told you so. Democracy was always doomed to fail. And they were waiting to come back and carve up the continent. They were going to colonize the continent. So democracy's on deck, and really the culmination of many of Washington's and the founding generation's worst fears 80 years after the birth of the nation, this devolution into civil war because of slavery, the original sin. Liberty, of course, is on the line, 4 million slaves located in the South, and that's what Lincoln understands there is this is how you deal with a contradiction, a divided system, that you need to reorient the nation, as Gary Wills pointed out and others, towards the Declaration of Independence rather than the Constitution, even though he and other Republican leaders at the time could point to the founding generation's intentions of the Constitutional Convention that slavery gradually die and sort of go out of existence over time. But the final question is the subject of the book, which is how do you stop the next war from igniting on the ashes of the past? And he says this is the most serious question ever brought to statesmen, right? It requires the gentleness of a dove and the wisdom of a serpent. And his key insight is that if you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. And that's particularly true in civil wars, right? Because you can't simply pound the opponents and your opponents into submission and salt the fields and rip up the culture, because you need to find a way to live together again. You can't do what Rome did to Carthage, not in a civil war. So that requires a deeper way of thinking. That requires a reconciling style of leadership. That requires rising above the normal cycle of revenge, which is part of what war is predicated upon. It requires thinking bigger. And that's what he does. He thinks about political, not only winning the war, but political reform to remove the root cause of slavery. He thinking about economic initiatives that could reunite the nation after the fact. And then finally, sort of the cultural dimension of that, which would be largely, but not exclusively, a function of his own personal example. And that's where I think some of the most profound stories from the book comes in. It's the way he practices the politics of the golden rule. And even within the realm of Lincoln, when you read a lot of books about any figure, you'll see a lot of books recycle the same 20 to 30 stories. That's definitionally not interesting. But with Lincoln, you can still pick out stories that are lesser well known, and they're enormously revealing and completely charming and very useful in terms of the applied history of it all, which is also what interests me. How can we take useful wisdom from this and apply it to our own times?
So I was going to actually ask you a question about centrism, but since I think
I'm happy to go there too.
Oh, I know. I'm sure you are. But I was thinking about
card-carrying member.
the question of reconciliation, right? Which I think you're talking about the difficulty in trying to put this country together and put it together, not just put it together, but put it together on the right lines. And so I guess one question I have about this is that surely you must believe that certain conflicts are not reconcilable, right? That there are certain situations where, right, you cannot reconcile two sides. That's why we have wars quite frequently. So my question would be this. You appear to be fairly confident in the book that the political and social difficulties associated with Reconstruction could be somehow overcome by somebody like Lincoln. And I guess, I mean, I know this is kind of a counterfactual, right? Because obviously...
Which I try not to do counterfactuals.
No, I know, but I mean, it's hard to avoid, right? I mean, it's hard to avoid in this particular case when we say, well, Lincoln has this plan. We think that he can perhaps succeed where Andrew Johnson fails because he completely makes a hash of it, right?
Low bar.
Low bar, right? Yeah. But I think we could also sort of say, like, what grounds do you have for feeling so confident that Lincoln could have overcome the difficulties associated with Reconstruction, like the social and political difficulties? Because on the one hand, what we're talking about is trying to placate white Southerners and at the same time provide the justice that is owed to black people living in the South. How could Lincoln thread that needle?
Well, I think by proposing a balanced and flexible plan that was focused on deeper principles. There are a lot of different ways to answer that question, and I'll tick them all off.
You could do all, yeah, good, all right.
So, I mean, first of all, I think all study of history, particularly presidential history, comes down to a core idea, which is that character is the indispensable quality in a president. It comes down to character, much more than certainly the party label of the time or even the deeper sort of, partisan disposition. Your mic has collapsed.
Yeah, it means I don't exist. All right, yeah.
So, one of the key things about Lincoln is that he is a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries, but Johnson is his exact opposite in terms of character. He's erratic rather than steadying. He is alternately radical and reactionary. He's motivated, the radicals in the Republican Party thought he would be a race warrior, but no, he's a class warrior. He's really primarily motivated by resentment and a desire for revenge, which is the opposite of what reconciling leaders do. And the actions he takes, in the early days of Reconstruction, send the country careening on the wrong course. Now, it's an example of the cost of what happens when you don't fully win the peace. We need to be important when we're writing about history not to assume more knowledge than the people at the time had. That's one of the tricks. It's a discipline to impose on yourself. So, they don't have perfect perspective. But what struck me was even in the late summer and early fall of 1865, already black codes were being passed in the South, which was basically sort of slavery without the chains. That you had, Confederate officers and generals assuming positions of power, which is precisely what Lincoln did not want. And in one speech I quote from a brigadier general who's speaking to the state legislature in Mississippi, he said, look, we have to accept the end of slavery. Right, 13th Amendment's passed, rejoining the Union is predicated upon ratification, but that doesn't mean we need to accept equality. And so they put forward all these other laws to basically institutionalize inequality. And I don't think it's too much to say that Lincoln, as a lawyer, would have done a lot more to ensure equal justice under law at the bare minimum. He's warning about the dangers of what can happen if there's a vacuum in law and order, which is that vigilantes would fill that void, precisely what happened. And then Grant, who's got Lincoln's advice in the back of his head, ends up finally dealing with that when he becomes president and pushes back the first incarnation of the KKK with something called the Enforcement Acts and has the, I think, Lincolnian sense of perspective to have a Southern Attorney General enforce those laws, a guy named Amos T. Ackerman, who's a fascinating and somewhat forgotten hero. I think that obviously, had Lincoln lived, he would have been met with great difficulty and he wouldn't have been martyred. But so much of what we admire about Lincoln was admired at his time as well. For example, the nickname Honest Abe was not something given to him after he died, like all dead politicians or statesmen. He was known as Honest Abe in his own time because he had a reputation for profound honesty. And that created credibility. He had enormous powers of empathy. One of the striking things, even in the early days of the Civil War, in the run-up to the Civil War, he says, I'm not anti-South or anti-Southern, I'm anti-slavery. He said, don't judge the South too harshly. They are just what we would be if we were in their position. That's a remarkable feat of empathy and understanding. The way he deploys humor, the way he has a defining degree of moral humility. Right? This is not a lack of ambition on his part. It's more than Midwestern modesty. It's a moral humility, right? So in the second inaugural, and my book is focused on the last 6 weeks of his life, kicking off with the second inaugural, you know, even though he's leading a nation in the middle of a civil war, he talks about we, and including we in the responsibility we all bear for the Civil War because we were all complicit in the original sin of slavery, even though the slaves were located primarily in the South. And that's sort of a larger, you know, moral humility written in sort of biblical principles that he brings to bear. So, you know, it's the last paragraph, the most famous one, that, you know, with malice toward none, with charity for all. That's the New Testament leadership paragraph, but it's a really Old Testament speech up to that point. So I think there's a lot to indicate in terms of the basic principles he's putting forward, in addition to his general political demeanor. I was shocked. Certainly some people in the South celebrated after he is assassinated, and I recount that. But many more, particularly generals, are really horrified about what's to come. I found an interview with Jefferson Davis towards the end of his life where he said, you know, that made all the difference because he was a good man, you know, as crude as he could be, he was a good man, and he was replaced by a demagogue, the worst of all men. And you know, among his broad principles he was already laying out as laying the groundwork for increasing political equality, is saying, look, we're going to let the Confederate rank and file, we want them to have amnesty. He says this over and over again to the generals on the River Queen. There's that famous portrait called The Peacemakers, which Harry Truman bought in 1947, which hangs in the White House. And it's Lincoln on the River Queen, which is the presidential steamship, and he's with Sherman, Grant, and Admiral Porter. It's a real meeting. The painting was informed by the participants' conversations and recreation of the conversation. And one of the things Lincoln keeps saying is give them, the Confederate rank and file, the most liberal and honorable terms. Let them have their guns to go home and shoot crows with and their horses to plow their fields with. We want them to return to the laws. All right, so he's specifically sending a message, don't be vindictive. We want a soft peace to follow a hard war as an inducement for the rank and file. But he also says in executive orders at that time, he says, look, preceding that by a few months, we're the people who knew better, the people who misled the Confederate rank and file, you know, former members of Congress, members of the courts, members of the military, who misled these people into outright rebellion, they should not be able to get amnesty out of the gate. They should not be able to reclaim all their power and prestige and property. Now, he's going to make sure, as a you know, lawyer who believed deeply in the Constitution, we weren't going to override these things. We weren't going to also treat them with the traditional punishment for treason, which is execution. But we're going to make sure they couldn't claw their power back right away. And in exchange for being more magnanimous to the Confederate rank and file, he says in his final speech that we wanted to open the door towards voting rights for blacks in America, African Americans, beginning with, he says, you know, the African American Union soldiers, 180,000 of them, by the way, who deserve disproportionate credit for turning the tide of the war and changing the meaning of the war, 25 of whom won the National Medal of Honor, which, by the way, we should be building statues to those people. Many of them were written out of history, inexcusably. And he said, and the very intelligent. So he's opening the door. But it's that balanced plan. And that's precisely what Johnson doesn't do. He gives amnesty to anybody who comes asking for it. He pulls black troops out of the South for fear of offending you know, white Southerners. And it allows the resentment to take hold. It's the worst of all worlds, and then sets off a pendulum swing with regard to the Republicans in Congress. So I think there's every reason to suggest it would have been different. Would it have been perfect? No, perfect's not on the menu. But I think for reasons rooted in character and policy, there's every reason to believe it would have been better.
Oh, better than Johnson.
Yeah, again, low bar.
That was your low bar, right?
But I think in a deep and profound and enduring way. He's also, he's a gradualist, as many people, you know, I call him a soulful centrist in the book. You know, he says, it will take some time for blacks and whites in the South to gradually grow themselves out of their old relationship with each other, right? And that's why he also wants to harness the power of economics to help reunite the nation on an east-west basis, right? What does he do in the darkest days of the war? He passes the Transcontinental Railroad Act, the you know, land-grant colleges, the Homestead Act. He wants people to move west to sort of reduce this north-south tension. And you know, the examples he makes constantly about magnanimity. But so he's not a utopian, right? He doesn't think you're going to flip the switch and change the country, but he's willing, if he has to fight a war to remove the core contradiction And so I think it's a different way of thinking about centrism. Very often, folks, moderates, you got to understand, the hit against your own side. And the perspective, it's mushy, the mushy moderates who don't believe in anything. That's the exact opposite of what Abraham Lincoln is. He's deeply motivated by principle. He is pragmatic, but he wants to remove the root cause that had divided the nation and created not only a contradiction, but made American democracy look like hypocritical in the eyes of the world. But he knew it would take time, and he was willing to unleash larger forces that could help reunite and reconcile the nation. And that's, I think, the mark of the genius of his leadership, that he's thinking so deeply and not thinking he's going to change human nature or flip the switch. Far from it. He wants to harness human nature.
So, okay, that's a lot to digest.
Yeah, it is, sorry, but you asked me a question.
No, I asked you a question. All's fair in love and war and discussions with you. So you noted his empathy, his honesty, his humor, and humility, and I think you had just adverted to a couple of those qualities. And I think one of the other qualities that I would maybe bring up in this context is also his capacity for growth, which I think in some ways would be the strength that would be required most for Reconstruction in some ways, like being able to move from one position to the next. There are a lot of characters during the Civil War who kind of move a great deal, from one position to the other, and Lincoln sort of moves quite a bit. And by the way, I'm not saying that he's being overly flexible or something, or saying he's without principle. But you do see a lot of people, like Grant himself, in the late 1850s is a Democrat and finds himself, like by the late 1860s, being like, the leader of the Republican Party, and not just sort of like on the conservative end, but, on a much more aggressive end. And you see a number of other people who are very hardcore Democrats before the war who really kind of go all the way to black suffrage. And I'm thinking of people like Benjamin Butler or people like Daniel Sickles, guys who are like almost like pro-Southern in the late 1850s who suddenly become.
Well, and I think you need to adjust people whose perspective changes because it's clear who's winning.
Right. No. But moving with the momentum of the times, I guess.
The momentum of the times. And here's where I think Lincoln as a political leader is really one of our greatest, right? Because he is able to harness public opinion and lead public opinion, but is very cautious about not moving too far too fast.
Right.
Right. And he's also very careful, for example, he's not going to just, take the Emancipation Proclamation and his reelection as a win. You need to translate that political capital into passing the 13th Amendment. And he shows, as the movie Lincoln brilliantly displays, he's very comfortable using transactional means to achieve transformational ends. And so he's thinking systemically in a much bigger way. He, read the first inaugural. He said, "Look, you are trying to portray me as a radical. I just want to stop slavery's expansion. I don't think I actually have the constitutional authority to end slavery." But then, as sometimes happens in life, the thing the Confederates are afraid of is the thing they create, the opportunity to end slavery via the Civil War. And for me, the sort of last word on that positioning and the evolution of it, outside the many interesting stories of individuals and there are many moving accounts also of how people's hearts and minds are changed by the bravery of black Union soldiers. That's still, there's a lot more work to be done in terms of publicly honoring those folks. But it's Frederick Douglass at the dedication of the Lincoln statue, which is now somewhat controversial, but it's in Washington, D.C. A replica of it was towed away in Boston. It's a really misunderstood statue. So let me explain why it's so misunderstood, and then talk about Frederick Douglass and what he said that day. That statue was one of the first built to Lincoln, and it was paid for by money sent in by former slaves, low dollar donations. The image, which makes people uncomfortable, is Lincoln standing up and a slave rising off his knees with the chains broken. So there is a clear power imbalance that strikes some people as racist or smacking of white supremacy, and let's again judge people within the context of their time. Lincoln is basically a single issue candidate his whole life, but we need to be careful about applying contemporary standards to folks in the past too easily. But this is the important thing. It's paid for by slaves. The image actually comes from the masthead or the logo on the William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, and the figure in Lincoln's place in that image is Jesus. So I sort of refer to him sometimes as the Jesus of American politics. That's the least of which is the reason for it. The dedication occurs, I think it's 1872, but might be slightly later. And Frederick Douglass is chosen to give the keynote. President of the United States in the audience, and so is all the members of the Supreme Court. But Frederick Douglass gives the keynote. And it's a brilliant speech, and it's a long speech. It's one of, Douglass gives many brilliant speeches, including, the Composite America, which I think is one of the speeches we need to return to a lot right now. But in it, he addresses this question of Lincoln's centrism and how much he shifted and his relationship with abolitionists. And he says, seen from the genuine abolitionist ground, he could seem tardy, cool, and indifferent to the cause of abolition. But seen from the perspective of an American statesman who is bound, honor-bound, duty-bound to consult the sentiments of his fellow citizens, he was zealous, determined, and radical. I think Douglass says it all there, right? I mean, you've got the activist class on one side, and they have a job, they have a role to play in bringing about social change. And they were often frustrated with Lincoln for not moving too fast. Lincoln was very careful and conscious about not moving too far, too fast out of fear of creating a backlash. But that's what political leaders do. And indeed, he moved forward the debate. He moved forward national sentiment. Remember, at the start of the war, this is part of what the draft riots are about in New York and elsewhere. That this is, reunite the nation, and we just give it up all. Even if you have to preserve slavery, it's worth it to stop all this bloodshed. But Lincoln says, no one wants peace more than I. But I'm unwilling to accept a peace if it's achieved on such grounds that it would only guarantee more bloodshed in the future. And so what you see is after his reelection, which itself is predicated on a couple of late military victories in Atlanta and Mobile, Alabama. Sentiment shifts. He's reelected. Emancipation Proclamation is codified. The 13th Amendment comes to pass. There is a level of political genius in terms of how he shifts public opinion so that by the end of the war, as I quote a New York Times editorial, people are stunned that there is now unanimity about the importance of ending slavery, where that had not existed, not even remotely, just a year or two before. Answer your question?
It sure does.
Okay.
Actually, it anticipates another question I was going to ask, which I don't have to ask anymore, so I have less work.
I'm just here to make it easier for you.
So here's thanks for coming all this way for that. All right, so I have a question about reconciliation in this book. So 2/3 of the book has to do with Lincoln directly, and his sort of policy of centrism and reconciliation and so on and so forth. And then the last third of the book has to deal with people who are in
the
some ways,
afterlife of the idea.
taking inspiration from the idea and moving on. What struck me about all of those examples is that they all follow wars. And I understand, right, you started this talk by mentioning that we don't give enough attention to the making of the peace, which I think is actually a very, very good idea. But what worries me a little bit when I read about this, right, is that all these examples of reconciliation happen after some sort of armed conflict. And usually, you can really mess up a reconciliation or mess up a peace, right? People have done it many times, right? But in some ways, reconciliation is a little bit easier after the end of the war because usually there's some kind of a victor who's got the upper hand who can potentially,
you focus on European history. You're digging your own grave here.
Potentially, but can potentially operate from a position of strength, which in some ways reconciliation has to be done from a position of strength, right?
Right.
So, okay, so far so good, all right? So I haven't dug my whole grave yet.
Go on.
Okay, so my question is, how does reconciliation work before the resort to arms, when it's not entirely clear who the stronger force is, or
Sure.
Some people are having fantasies about how some sort of armed conflict would work out, because we don't find ourselves at the end of a war right here. We find ourselves in a
Right. Okay. So let's take that as it comes. First of all, one of the virtues of reading history in our time, particularly Civil War history, is I think a reminder that we've been through far worse before. Okay. That's the first thing. Second thing is, anybody who talks about Second Civil War in any way that's casual or designed to foment the base, that is a sign of sickening disrespect to 750,000 dead Americans and total willful ignorance about what war means in a democracy, especially ours, given our experience. And I'm not even going to deal with sort of the Nat Turner fringe of folks who want to, fetishize this stuff. Look, there've been folks like that throughout our history, and we will put that genie back in the bottle, as we have, although there are best practices for doing so. I will note one of which can be found in the story, which I tell in the chapter USA versus KKK, of how President Grant uses the Enforcement Act to dismantle the KKK, much along the lines that Lincoln suggested. Amnesty for rank and file, but you put the ringleaders in jail, right, for a long time. Accountability is key in this case. Obviously, this book is a story of war and peace. I want to understand that the flip side of those two things. So, there are plenty. I mean, Washington's Farewell, my previous book, is also about a reconciling leader, not in wartime, but at a time when the Republic was incredibly fragile, and how, through the prism of his parting wisdom to his friends and fellow citizens, he was able to steady the nation and carry forward those principles. When you look at the nature of reconciling leadership, and it's a term that doesn't get used a lot, and I wish I'd come up with a pithier phrase for it, but there's a professor who described it fairly well. It talks about reconciliation-oriented leadership, right? It really sings. Reflecting the ability to control desires for vengeance and retaliation against enemies, optimistic assessments of others' capacity for change, non-judgmental, non-dogmatic, and practical approaches to conflict resolution. So sometimes the term is, the political science term is conflict resolution, other times it's conflict transformation. And that's really what this book discusses within the context of American history. Lincoln's invention of, or becoming an avatar for, reconciling leadership carries forward in surprising ways, one of which I track is there's a surprising number of Nobel Peace Prize winners who all idolize Lincoln and or quote him in their speeches. Martin Luther King quoted Lincoln all the time. For example, one thing I was struck by was when Nelson Mandela died, one of his primary biographers, a guy named John Carlin, who wrote a great book called Playing the Enemy, described him as Africa's Lincoln. And what he said basically was, but Mandela and Lincoln did the most difficult thing there is to do, which is they rose to political power without trying to divide their fellow countrymen into us against them. Basically, that any fool can do that. That's the easy way to achieve political power, but that actually compounds problems. What reconciling leaders do is they take a divided system and they make it whole and consistent. They lift up the conversation on the basis of shared humanity, common humanity, rather than appealing to tribal divides. And I think that's what destructive and divisive leaders inherently do. They appeal to tribal divides, and they set society against one another. So there are plenty of examples in domestic politics, not that intention is going to be a panacea, right? Part of the lesson of Lincoln and Washington is you can be the most unifying, iconic leaders in the we view today and still be deeply hated in your own lifetime, especially if you take strong stands on deep moral issues. But there are more or less divisive ways to do that. And I think that's what Lincoln's example really, why it endures. I sort of referenced this line earlier, but one of the things that Sherman says, looking back on Lincoln, he said, of all the great, he was of all the great men I knew, he was the one with the most goodness. Of all the good men I knew, he had the most greatness. And I think understanding those qualities and being as deeply entwined is partly why you see this deep and enduring and abiding affection for Lincoln, and why I think he continues to inspire. Now, I can get to the cycles of how you can lose a piece and how they were applied if you want. You want to go there? Or you want to?
Maybe I'll ask one last question because we're going to have to move to a Q&A with the audience here. But maybe I'm going to follow up on what you were just talking about, and I'm sure this is a question you've probably faced before. I'm sure it's occurred to you. You mentioned in the book that when we think about the difficulty of producing Lincoln in our own time, that Lincoln was kind of unique in his own time, right? There aren't a lot of Lincolns like walking around in mid-19th century America, and so he's kind of unusual there. So I guess my question though is what is our capacity now to produce a political figure? I mean, is our political system actually capable of producing a Lincoln who would operate in the fashion that you're talking about, or at least that you're recommending?
Yes.
Okay.
But
all right, we're all done.
It's about not looking for another Lincoln, but it's about looking for leaders of a similar spirit.
Right. Well, I didn't mean literally, but
Right,
yeah,
right, no, no,
right.
but I
Okay,
mean,
yeah.
we
Right.
would a 6'4", man who'd only, been, one of the things I love about Lincoln is when you look at letters from people who meet him for the first time, one of the things they invariably say is, he's the ugliest man I've ever met.
Yeah.
And then when he starts speaking, something beautiful happens to him. His face lights up, his countenance lights up. Even when he's, this guy is towards the end of the war, he's 6'4" and weighs 160 pounds. He is deeply, deeply tired on a soul deep level. But I think it is a matter of the incentive structures we've set up. And this goes back to, I think, the core problem of our politics today as I see it and define it. It is a problem rooted in hyperpartisanship and polarization, and it's exacerbated by the incentive structures we have created. The two parties have become more and more polarized asymmetrically, right? The Republican Party is objectively further right than the Democratic Party is left. But when you get to closed partisan primaries, which thankfully, New Hampshire, good home with independents, where more independents than Democrats or Republicans can sort of, calm those waters sometimes. But that creates a situation where, especially in a time of decreased competitive congressional seats, certainly, through the rigged system of redistricting, that means that people in Congress spend all their time looking over their respective left or right flanks, solving problems and working across the aisles of political risk that is likely to gain them a primary. And that means that the most extreme people are the ones most likely to get the party's nomination, which in many cases is de facto the election. And that creates a lack of a depth of bench when it comes to people who can be reconciling and unifying leaders. So we set up a structure not to elevate Lincolns. But remember how unlikely Lincoln was in his time. This is part of the capacity for growth point. It's a guy, the nation's already looking like it's on the verge of civil war, and they don't come up with a military leader, and he's got no military experience, right? He's an honorary captain in the Black Hawk War, and he jokes that, the bloodiest fight he found was with a bunch of mosquitoes. He's got no executive experience. He's never been a mayor, never been a governor, never run a business, not really. So you get a guy who's had one term in Congress, like a decade before, leading a brand new upstart, effectively third party. And he is widely disrespected and dismissed. And yet, because of character, he shows a capacity for growth. He wasn't formally schooled at all. Incidentally, if you look at the presidents who weren't formally educated, certainly up to college, there's a lot to recommend that, I think. I mean, Lincoln, Washington, Harry Truman, Grant, it's a pretty good list. But, he read Aesop, he read the Bible, he read Shakespeare. It's one of the reasons he speaks in parables. It's Aesop in the Bible, very consciously. And so those are all keys to, I think, his political genius. So I think we need to be looking for individuals of a similar spirit, that reconciling spirit. But we need to be really wide-eyed about when we're playing with fire as a country, right? Which is when we start indulging people who play tribal politics, right? When we start seeing the political parties play out to their extremes in ways that are not representative of the American character, the American experience, or frankly, the American people. That we're setting ourselves up for real trouble. And this isn't hypothetical, right? We saw a Confederate flag in the US Capitol on January 6th. Didn't happen during the Civil War. So that's where I think there's an obligation as citizens of a democratic republic to learn our history. That's why there's an obligation to give a damn about politics, to study our history, to think about applying the lessons of history, so we don't have to make these same mistakes. And it's very easy to see which is the wrong path, not only in the United States, but particularly in the United States, this tribal divisive appeal to politics. And the alternative are leaders who can take principled stands, but to find a way to try to unite us by appealing to our common humanity, by appealing to older, deeper traditions upon which the country is based. That's not just Lincoln calling back to the Declaration of Independence. That's what MLK does at the I Have a Dream speech, which, lest we forget, is far from the only speech he ever gave, but a really good example of that approach. So partly it's on us as citizens of a democratic republic. We have to get involved. We have to throw our shoulder to the wheel and apply the lessons of history. And then we also need to restore civics education. And places like this do a really important job of that, not only here, but that's why you have a nationwide reputation. So we have to do a better job of looking for individuals of a similar spirit. And that's accessible to us every 2 to 4 years. I'd say that.
All right, well, with that, why don't we turn to questions from the audience? So I think we have some people, yes, we have people walking
Mic
around
guys
with mics.
just showed up out of
So
the
why don't
audience.
we, yeah, why don't we
wielding
start?
mics with ties.
Whoa, don't run away.
on.
There's a gentleman in the front who wants to ask a question.
Well-dressed
There we go.
man in blue.
All right. Whoops, is it on?
Yes, sir.
All right. So,
Wardrobe malfunction.
right, yell it out.
How thin was the line
Test this one.
oh, great. And his personal life?
How thin was the line between Lincoln's professional life and his personal life? I'm going to need you to go a little deeper on that question so I can answer it well.
Okay, like as far as his personal life with his wife, his family, did it get affected when he was in his hardest position?
Oh, for sure. So the question is about, I guess, not thin, it's how his personal life affected his professional life or his public life. Understanding particularly our greatest figures, taking them off a pedestal and understanding the people, I think is one of the things that I try to do and I think great history does. I think our greatest leaders are much more interesting when you take them off the pedestal and understand them as flawed, conflicted human beings with strengths and weaknesses. And Lincoln is famously, I mean, he is sunshine and shadow. That's one of the things that makes him often more relatable than, for example, Washington, who imposed a mask of command. Lincoln is telling stories all the time. He's not, he looks very solemn, from today's perspective, but he gets incredibly criticized for telling jokes. What's interesting to me is why he's telling jokes, and this gets to the impact of the personal. 1862 is the worst year of Lincoln's life. His son Willie, their beloved middle son, dies in the White House. That leads Mary, who they had a complicated relationship. She is understandably overcome with grief. That draws a wedge between them even further, possibly compounded by medicines that were given to her at the time. And the Union looks like it's losing the war. Right? This is the time where Lincoln, who is not a member of any particular denomination, becomes much more religious. One of the stories that I write about, I love this. He reads the book of Job for comfort, and is seen as emerging, quote, oddly cheerful. There's a story about his joking and his humor and how it's a salve to himself at this time. He's got a friend, he's an Illinois congressman named Isaac N. Arnold. And after the Union loses a devastating defeat in the spring of 1862, Isaac N. Arnold comes to the White House to check on his friend. Knows he's been depressed, death of his son. And at that time, you go up and knock on the door, and the doorman lets you in, and you just go on up to the White House. It's a different deal. He goes to the second floor, and Lincoln is sitting by the fire in an otherwise darkened room, reading a book of one of his favorite humorists, in this case, a guy named Artemus Ward. His two favorites were Artemus Ward and Petroleum V. Nasby. And Lincoln is laughing. And Isaac N. Arnold, congressman, loses it. He lays into his friend and he says, "What are you doing? How the hell can you be laughing at a time like this?" And in Arnold's memoir, he talks about how Lincoln throws the book down. And he looks up to him with tears brimming in his eyes and says, "Don't you know that if I could not find a way to make myself laugh, my heart would break and I couldn't do my job?" So all the inveterate joking and storytelling was a means of communication, but it was also a means of self-medication. And look also what he does in 1862. Famously, he continues the construction of the Capitol Dome. People said this is a waste of money, we should be spending it on munitions, but he's conscious of the symbolism of that. But look what also he does. I mentioned this briefly, but the economic dimension for his vision for how to reunite the nation a decade out of the war is a profound thing. He pushes through, with Republicans, who don't have a lot of Democrats because many of them have seceded, the Transcontinental Railroad Act, the Homestead Act, and land grant colleges. All very far-sighted things that Lincoln was not even see the benefit of in a second term, even had he lived to finish a second term. But they were, even in that moment of great despair, he's thinking about many moves out, how you can reunite the nation. And that is also a tremendous feat of self-discipline. He's not wallowing in a self-pity that makes him myopic and unable to see into the future. He is using his leadership to create larger forces and move them into play to reunite the nation, despite the enormous pain he's feeling. Hope that answers your question.
All
What
right.
else?
Right
sir.
there. Yep.
Thank you. So my question actually has two parts. So you've
Love a good
in this
two-part question.
speech and in other of your works, you've extolled the values of centricism. So my question is, do you think centrism is predicated on a certain level of acceptance or contentment with the status quo? And if it is, how do you market centricism to people who are deeply unhappy with the status quo in the United States?
I utterly reject the first premise. And let's just use the example of Abraham Lincoln, because it seems relevant. James Buchanan is the guy, I guess, defending the status quo and sending us on a glide path toward civil war through inaction. Constantly vacillating, finding justifications for the South to begin the preparations of secession. Lincoln is laying out very clear, non-maximalist positions. He's being described as a radical by the reactionaries and a reactionary by the radicals. He's trying to put through a plan of reform with an eye towards reconciliation without compromising core moral principles within the context of his power. It's not a defense of the status quo, not even a little bit. And so I think that's where you've got a fundamental sort of problem with centrism as it's understood, as I understand it. I'm advocating the vital center. I'm advocating trying to address the great challenges of our time in a proactive way. And I think if you look at Washington today, the status quo is not centrism at all. I mean, in 1980, 60% of the senators could be described as moderate. There was a high degree of overlap between the parties. There were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. And one of the many things that meant was when you had divided government, you could cobble together coalitions. And it was far from perfect. There were tons of problems. But if you look at the voting patterns for that period from, call it 1930 through mid-1960s, an enormous amount gets done when you've got that kind of cross-pollination, right? I mean, the Marshall Plan passes, with Harry Truman's president, an investment in peace, by the way, foregoing a peace dividend, working with Republicans who briefly controlled Congress at that time, including, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, right? I mean, that's how you win the peace after the Second World War, setting up all those structures that we have remembered are valuable today, including NATO and the United Nations, for that matter. It's Harry Truman working. President Eisenhower working with Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson to get the international the Highway Act that we all take for granted today. It's working. It's Republicans and Democrats being led by a Southern Democrat to pass civil rights legislation. On and on and on. So it's about finding constructive, principled compromise that addresses the great challenges of the time. It is not a defense of the status quo. The problem with our politics today, and this has been true since, when were you born? Okay, that's amazing. And no, way before your lifetime, we'll call it a decade. The problem has been the exact opposite. The status quo in politics, particularly in Congress, has been increasing polarization. That's the establishment. That's the status quo. And it's finally time for folks in the center to start acting like and get some swagger back and calling it out for what it is. That's the problem afflicting our country, and that's what's hurting our democracy in the eyes of the world. It's that kind of division and dysfunction. There you go. You're welcome. I get fired up about this stuff. Yes, sir. Wait, what? Oh, someone behind you has a microphone. Then you'll get yours. Yes, sir.
Hi. Oh, good. It's working now. First of all, thank you so much for all of your information about President Lincoln. I've learned a lot this evening about his approach. And I also agree with you completely about the polarization. I wanted to comment on next week's town hall because I think that is inadvertently contributing to it because the questionnaire to submit questions for CNN and St. A's, you have to disclose your political party. You also have to disclose who you voted for in the last election. and then it's decided whether or not you can participate. And I understand the need for having questions about name, address, date of birth for security reasons, but if it's a true town hall, and if New Hampshire's voters are really going to be able to participate, we should not have those threshold screening questions.
I appreciate that.
I'd like to
and-
participate, but I'm not going to share that information.
Okay, fair, and I'm not going to question the processes of the town hall being put in place by CNN, where, as you all know, I work. I will say that that general framework for a town hall is standard over previous elections. When you're in the primary period, what you want to do is get questions from a live audience of people who are either members of their party or independents, who can vote. Which, thank you, New Hampshire, you can vote. Independents can vote, which you can't in many states, unfortunately, because that creates a context for where we are in this stage. Donald Trump is the front runner for the Republican nomination right now. And so that's just, I think, a fairly standard way of making sure the audience is coming from the broad perspective of the candidate, and I believe that is the standard that would be applied to whether a candidate were on a Republican running the state or a contested primary on the Democratic side.
Over the years, over the last 20 years, I've attended events by all parties, everybody. I've never had that question.
I can't speak to that because I just don't, but I do know that CNN is deeply committed to sort of being fair-minded, and obviously there are peculiarities to a former president running with regard to security that may influence this stuff as well. But I can't speak to that because I just don't, outside my purview, so to speak. But it will be, more history made in this room next week. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, but there's a microphone coming so everyone else can.
Here it is. Now you hear me better. I guess you still say you read a book, but I listened to your book, and pretty good narrator.
Well, thank you.
And-
Better than the alternative.
And I've read a lot of Lincoln books, and I started out thinking, well, this is the same old, but I understand why you needed to do all that background. And then you got into these stories about those last 6 weeks. And to your point earlier about his decency and humanity, the thing that you wrote about that really, I was driving 60 miles an hour, and I probably had a tear in my eye when you told the stories about him visiting the Southern soldiers in the Army hospital. And it was just amazing. I don't think I had ever heard those stories before. But I'm curious how you found those and resourced those stories.
Thank you. First of all, I hope you didn't hit anything, 60 with a tear in your eye, so I appreciate that. I love the research of these books, and I have a couple sort of broad rules. I try not to read anything written in the last 20 years on the subject I'm writing about. I just don't want that music in my head. But I really enjoy the sort of research process. And what you found is, in the case of the soldiers, I'll tell the story, old testimonies from really old out-of-print books or collections of testimonies about soldiers who met Lincoln on both sides of the divide. So the story I think you're talking about is a powerful one. So Lincoln, after he gives the second inaugural address, gets sick and then gets out of Dodge. Grant invites him to come to what was then called City Point, Virginia. It was the Union headquarters. It was basically behind enemy lines, but as the way that the Chesapeake goes at that place. And there's been a 9-month siege of Petersburg. And so Lincoln goes down with Tad. Mary is briefly with him, but then there's a outburst and she goes back to Washington. This is where, the centerpiece of the book is Lincoln walking into Richmond 2 days after the city has fallen. It's one of the most cinematic moments in American history. It gets short shrift even in multi-volume biographies of Lincoln. I don't know why. To me, it is one of the most cinematic moments. I mean, he walks into the city that is still utterly unsecured, on fire, and he goes and he walks, is sort of mobbed by newly liberated former slaves, and then sits in Jefferson Davis's White House chair and looks out the window. It's the whole thing is just an extraordinary. He meets with members of the Confederate cabinet. But then before he's getting back to go back, once Richmond falls, Jefferson Davis isn't captured yet, but the end of the war is in sight. And he goes and he does what presidents do to this day. He visits wounded soldiers in what was then a field hospital. It's called the Depot Field Hospital. And it was state-of-the-art for its time, and hundreds of beds, like more than 1,000 individuals. And he does what presidents do. He goes up and he introduces himself to the soldier and hears their story. And Lincoln is a very emotional guy. He gets very overwhelmed. There are these amazing cases where, it looks like a young man is going to die. He's had an amputation. He said, "No, my boy, you must live." And he starts crying, and, he's very emotional. And he's exhausted. So he finishes up hundreds of beds and stories. And he's getting ready to leave, and he's being escorted by a doctor who's, trying to play up to the president, as people do. And Lincoln spies a smaller tent out back. And Lincoln says, "What's that out there?" Doctor says, "Oh, Mr. President, you don't need to worry about that. Those are just wounded rebel soldiers." And Lincoln says, "That's exactly where I do need to go." And he does the exact same thing. And he goes up and he introduces himself. And the testimonies that people were telling decades later, one Kentucky colonel says, I hope you're offering your hand to a man who spent the last 4 years trying to defeat you and would have slit your throat on the battlefield. He said, "Well, I hope you will not refuse me your hand." And the man looking back years later says, "The moment I looked in his eye, I knew I was whipped." Partly because, they'd been told he was a tyrant and a butcher and a killer. And they looked in his eye and saw he was a kind man who cared about him and the suffering and felt enormous pain for the suffering the nation was undergoing. And that was deeply disarming. And you see those stories over and over again in the final weeks of his life. These magnanimous gestures where he rises above all the resentment and desire for revenge, and he's able to soften hearts and open minds. And that's the necessary precondition for real reconciliation. So thank you for that. Thank you.
All right, I think we might have time for one more question. No?
Neil!
Neil is going to ask a question.
I never get to ask
Oh,
a
he's
question.
shutting it
All
down.
right.
I can't tell. Okay.
Maybe it's because I've been reading all the books of people who want to become president, those books no one reads. But
My condolences.
just a compliment, I've read the book, and then I listened to it as well. And for all of you, John narrates the book on tape. Your prose is amazing.
Thank you.
The cadence of the whole thing, it's just amazing. And it was so wonderful to read it and listen to it. I was really impressed.
Oh, thanks, Neil.
So we always think about, when we think about Lincoln, we think about the team of rivals and all of that. So when he's doing these things, there must have been incredible sort of pressure, or sort of some of these people that are around him to sort of throw him under the bus to try to capture power. We see it all the time now. Were there any instances of that where he was trying to be magnanimous towards the South and people threw him under the bus?
Sure. You're right. I mean, Doris's great book, Team of Rivals, does capture the quintessence of that side of his leadership, which shows a comfort with disagreement, right? Wanting to hear all sides and be the ultimate arbiter. But you saw particularly at the end of the war, and I think this is what you're alluding to, is that he's already steeling himself for a fight with the radical Republicans who have been the base of his support, right? He's played a mediating role, and one of the things I love is John Hay, his secretary, who goes on to be Secretary of State, has a great definition of American foreign policy in the late 19th century, by the way. He says, we're guided by two principles, the Monroe Doctrine and the Golden Rule. I like that. But Hay calls the radical Republicans the Jacobins, because they're always sort of stifling progress. They're sort of these sort of absolutists. And Lincoln is running into this buzzsaw towards the end of the war. He knows that the radical Republicans in his cabinet, they want revenge. They want to rip the South out. They want to occupy, destroy all the state lines. These states have given up any right to be recognized as states under the Constitution by the mere act of rebellion. And it should be a punitive, punishing reconstruction. And Lincoln is saying, no, we need to treat these people like men. We need to think about human nature. We need to appeal to the better angels of their nature. We need to create structures in place to incentivize them to do the right thing. This is a point you made. Lincoln believes that the politics of the golden rule is predicated upon this idea that people are willing to, decency can be the most practical form of politics, but it's always most effective when offered from a position of strength. So there's a balance there. But it's not about an ideological imposition top-down, and Lincoln is already resisting those forces. And indeed, one of the things that's so striking and I think terrifying towards the end of his life is some of the radical Republicans in Congress. They are so infuriated by Lincoln's sort of plans for a magnanimous peace that one of them, Benjamin Wade, goes up to Andrew Johnson, and he says, I hope that Lincoln is assassinated because you will be far better on the South because you'll be tougher, right? They thought that he was sort of a race warrior, and he would be their guy, and they badly misjudged Andrew Johnson. They spent the next 4 years fighting him. So you saw Lincoln constantly meeting this, and sometimes he uses humor, and sometimes he loses his temper, rarely. He is constantly trying to keep in mind everybody's ambitions and agendas. Salmon P. Chase constantly threatening to resign, and one day Lincoln just accepts it, and he's kind of stunned. And then he kicks him upstairs to go be, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Why? Well, in part because he knows that way, things like the Emancipation Proclamation won't get tossed out. The larger goals he's pursuing won't be removed, and he's removing a rival by kicking him upstairs to the Supreme Court. He says important ideas may and must be inflexible. But on the details, he's always willing to be enormously flexible. And that frustrates some folks who don't see the broader chessboard that Lincoln's playing with in his own sort of backwoods common sense way. And those are cautionary tales about dealing with people who are insisting on absolutism and maximalist practices. What Lincoln understood, what I think centrists instinctively do, is that these utopian dreams always end in nightmares. You need to deal with the building blocks of society, these tiny platoons. You need to harness the human nature, which is why, frankly, studying Aesop, the Bible, and Shakespeare is a pretty darn good syllabus for anyone seeking to be a leader in a democratic republic. But ultimately what's so striking, and what we didn't talk a lot about tonight, but is the afterlife of the idea, how Lincoln's ideas are vindicated, partly by contrast with what happens under Johnson, and a certain return under Grant. But even applied forward, I mean, you want a case in point geopolitically for what happens when you lose a peace is the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. When Lincoln meets with Confederates, he has 3 indispensable conditions. Everything else is negotiable. One is an acceptance of the federal union, right, or basically a renunciation of any alleged right to secession. An end to slavery for all time. Remove the root cause of the war. And the third is the surprising one, no ceasefire before surrender. And there's a great story about this because he meets with Confederate negotiators on the River Queen. And the first thing they say is, look, let's reunite, have Congress give us a ceasefire, and then we're going to go invade Mexico together to dislodge the Emperor Maximilian. And Lincoln laughs at them and says that's not going to work on a million different reasons. But the key one is, if you give a ceasefire before surrender, he knew the political will to ratify the 13th Amendment and end slavery would disappear. And if you look at what went wrong in the under Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles, there was not an unconditional surrender. There was literally a ceasefire before surrender. There was a protracted negotiation. There ended up being a punishing peace with excessive reparations. And as one French field marshal said, this isn't a peace, it's a 20-year ceasefire. Which is why when the World War II generation emerges, and they're the grandchildren of the Civil War, they talk and think about Lincoln a lot. The official position is unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. I found a quote where the book began, a quote from General Lucius Clay, who read the German occupation, who was a Southerner, who, when he was asked what guided your decisions, he said, I tried to think what Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. If you look at the act and the passage of the Marshall Plan and the way it was done in a bipartisan manner to invest in peace, the opposite of reparations, that's all Lincoln's wisdom. And it can be criticized by some people for not being tough enough. How can you be spending money to rebuild enemies as well as allies? But that approach succeeded in a profound way. And so I think it is that deeper wisdom of reconciling leadership proved its mettle and caused us to finally win a peace and stop that cycle of violence. And I think that's one of Lincoln's great gifts to us, in addition to the lessons of his leadership. So Neil, thank you. Thank you all.
All right.
Always a pleasure. to be
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.